Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to Wednesday. If you're here in Vancouver, you'll see it's a little bit overcast this morning, so maybe that'll keep it a bit cooler today. I know yesterday and the day before was pretty warm. Did anyone have trouble sleeping or not so much? It's a little hot. It was a little hot in my building last night. I had to use the fan to stay cool. Okay, so Casey's here. Good morning, Casey. Thika's here. Hello. Good evening to you. Morning, Karen. Morning, Jenna. Mashid is here. Good morning, Mashid. Jimmy's here. Good morning, Jimmy. Good evening, Erica. Karen was perfectly fine. Morning, Manish. I'm glad, Karen. Yeah, that's good. I was a little warm in here, but not too bad. I bought an air conditioner a couple of years ago, but I haven't used it because I've been keeping my doors open, the door to the apartment door to the hallway, so that gets air moving through and sort of cools the place off better. Baha's here. Good morning, Baha. And Krish. Good morning, Krish. Okay, so here's what we'll do today. We'll finish off the sexism stuff. I'll just do a short summary of some of the things that we've talked about. And then we'll move on to ableism. And ableism is it's a less visible, I think, form of oppression, but it's also one that's more complicated because people who fit into that category of disabled, sometimes there's sort of controversy about who fits into that category, but also it's a very diverse group of people, right? And so if you're talking about racial groups and you're talking about black people, for instance, black people are in that social category because their skin is dark colored, right? That's why they're in there. But and that marker is similar. But for disabled people can be kind of disabled in all kinds of different ways. And so again, it's a very diverse group of people that sort of wind up in that social category. But we'll try to pull that apart a little bit and get a bit of an understanding of how disabilities and disableism affects the lives of people. But we'll do that. And then yesterday, I believe, we had some questions about paper structure. So I assigned the final paper to you, the final paper. I assigned it, and there were some questions about structure, and so I'll talk about that. I'll talk about that a little bit later too. So we'll do those three things today, okay? Caleb's here. Good morning, Caleb. And Monica's here. Good morning, Monica. Okay, so let's summarize this, okay? So in this section, what we were trying to do is look at sexism, right? And sexism, remember, was an unequal relationship in which the dominant group, men, benefit from and have opportunities based on the minoritization and marginalization of other genders, mostly women, but also people who are transgender, people who are gender non-binary or gender fluid. Men tend to benefit from the disadvantages these people face. And so we paid particular attention in this unit to the role of media, right? Advertising, music videos, movies, and how they continue to sort of allow sexism to exist and to continue because they continually transmit sexist messages to us even while we're trying to enjoy our favorite shows, right? Good morning, Duong. Yeah, so sexism is a term we use to describe an unequal relationship in society between men and people of other genders, right? And so we started off with this, if you'll recall, and remember that these things are not necessarily connected in the way that sometimes we assume that they are, right? So someone's biological sex is their sex assigned at birth, right? And that sex is assigned based on a baby's physical body, right? So the baby is born, the doctor looks at the baby's genitals and says it's a boy or it's a girl, right? And then that's kind of it. It goes on the birth certificate and on the hospital forms, and then parents begin to raise this child as a boy or as a girl. Good morning, Hossam. But there are many other elements to this individual person's identity, right? Their gender identity specifically. And so we've sort of come to know, although many other cultures historically already knew this, we've come to know that gender is something that comes from the inside as well, right? It's something that people feel. It's a way that people identify themselves. And sometimes we have individuals who their sex assigned at birth is not the same as their gender identity, right? And we said those individuals are transgender individuals. But of course that can express itself in many ways, and so people's gender expression can be more toward what we define as traditionally masculine. It can be more toward traditionally feminine. So sex and gender can kind of vary in those ways, and again, they're not exactly the same thing, right? We said sex has to do with biology, with people's physical bodies and with their genetic coding, but gender has to do with culture, right? It has to do with how people feel about themselves and the role that they perform in society. So that was gender. And then we kind of lumped in sexual orientation and attraction as well. And so gender and sexual orientation should also be seen as kind of separate as well, right? So we said that people can be attracted to women, they can be attracted to men, or they can be attracted to both sexes or both genders, or in some cases neither. We also know that people's romantic attraction can vary separately as well. So people might be, one individual might be sexually attracted to both men and women, but they might only want to have a romantic relationship with a man. They might not want a romantic relationship with a woman. So all of these things kind of operate reasonably independently. And so, someone who is cisgender, so their biological sex is in alignment with their gender identity, someone who is cisgender and someone who is heterosexual and is romantically attracted to the opposite gender, that's certainly the most common scenario, but there's lots of other combinations that occur as well. And so what we should remember is that all of these things are kind of reasonably independent, in that if we see someone and they look like a man or they look like a woman to us, that doesn't mean we can necessarily assume anything else about them, right? Because again, all of these things can and do vary amongst people. But regardless of what our gender is, the society we're born into has rules about gender, right? And we will be taught from a very early age what those rules are and how to follow them. And if we don't follow them, we will be good. Hello, Ivan. There will be punishments, right? People will try to get us to follow the rules and try to get us to be what a woman is or be what a man is, usually depending on our sex assigned at birth, right? But again, good morning, Benamir. But again, because we are taught that these sort of sex and gender differences are natural and that they're biological, we often don't question how much socialization goes into these gender roles. But I'd like you to try to keep in mind here that much of our gender roles, much of what we define as being a man or being a woman, most of those things are culturally constructed, okay? There are biological differences between men and women. I think we all intuitively know that. But much of the way we behave and much of the way that we try to role, create a picture of the ideal man or the ideal woman, a lot of that is culturally constructed. A lot of that is what our rules, our culture has made up. And so, based on those roles, in popular media, particularly in ads, we often see that those societal gender roles, those arbitrary gender roles that have been created for men and women, are reflected back to us. Okay? And they're usually reflected back to us because they are easy to understand, right? They're kind of stereotypical. We all kind of know, the typical family with dad going to work and mom, at home with the kids. We all kind of understand that very common stereotype. And so advertisements tend to show us that over and over again so that we don't pay attention to it and we pay attention to the product they're trying to sell. So again, we often see very stereotypical roles for men and stereotypical roles for women. Usually, unless the commercial is trying to sort of make a joke of one of those things, but we often see very stereotypical roles for men and women. We see women looking after the kids and being responsible. We see men taking care of cars and barbecuing. Sometimes we see certain characteristics. I think what we saw was women were shown as kind of competent and mature and on top of things, and men tended to appear clueless and foolish, and I think I suggested why that might be. And again, we see the normalcy of dominant groups. And so often what we see in ads, at least here in Canada and the US, and I can't speak for other countries of the world, obviously, but here in Canada and the US, we often see dominant groups represented in ads. So we see middle or upper class people. We overwhelmingly see white people, but not all the time anymore. We usually see married couples with kids. Those married couples are almost always heterosexual. We almost never see a gay couple in a commercial, although we're starting to. And so this kind of reinforces the fact that dominant groups are the normal ones. Yeah, so we see these roles for men and women and sort of the dominance of men over and over again, and we come to see them as normal. We come to see them as the ideal, right? We talked a little bit about misogyny, if you'll recall. Misogyny was the exclusion or the hostility towards or the outright hatred of women. And we see it play out in a number of different ways in society. And so we watched a few clips of The Big Bang Theory, and we saw how women were kind of criticized and put down, and sexist comments were made about them, but framed in a way that seemed harmless, right, and seemed funny. But when you kind of took a step back, and when the author of that video essay kind of explained it to us, it's much more clearly visible what was happening in that show, right? And women were, the sexist comments against women were being played up for laughs, if you will. We also looked at some of Harrison Ford's films, and again, we could extend these to many sort of male-oriented action films as well. But popular films like that are agents of socialization, particularly for young men who might be looking for a male role model, right? Someone to imitate, right? Someone who you would model yourself after because they're cool, right? And so we watched this video and we saw that Harrison's characters, and of course Harrison Ford's characters aren't the only ones in cinema that do this. There are lots of them. They often treat women badly, right? They don't listen to them. They don't take no for an answer. They keep pushing. They ignore women's anger, and they use their sort of size and power to threaten and intimidate women. And we said, of course, that that's very, very wrong, right? That's sexual harassment, basically. And so none of that was okay. But again, we saw that because in the context of the film, Harrison Ford's characters are framed as the good guy and the hero, and of course the female character that he is trying to seduce usually goes along with it. We're meant to see it as romantic, but again, in real life, that stuff is not romantic at all. Okay. We talked a little bit about music videos, in particular, we talked about Ariana Grande, and I tried to make the point that much of the pop music we see today, particularly for young women, is highly sexualized. And I was trying to argue the point, and I don't know if I was successful, but I tried to argue the point that really I think what's happening is an over-sexualization of a lot of that music. And I was trying to point it out with the Ariana Grande song because the video is highly sexualized, but the song itself is not, right? The song lyrics are not about sex, they're not about boyfriends, they're not about love, they're not about any of that stuff. It's about something totally different. But the video is very sexy, right? And so the question was, you know, is her over-sexualization a choice that she makes? Is it her expressing herself, or is it her kind of submitting to a male audience and trying to do what her male audience wants? I didn't explain that very well, but we'll leave it there. The problem, of course, is that for Ariana and for lots of other female pop stars, they have a very young audience. They have a female audience, and they have an audience that kind of leans to the young side. In some cases, as young as 7, 8, 9 years old. And so, I think it's a good idea to question what kind of lessons are being taught to these girls through music and videos like this. Again, if you're 24 years old and you enjoy the songs, you are kind of old enough to, hopefully, you are old enough to understand the messages that you are being given. But when you're 8 or 9 years old, you are not. And so I think it's a good idea to think about what kind of social messages are being transmitted in music and music video like Ariana Grande's when her audience is quite young, right? Or part of her audience is quite young. We went on to talk about why sexism exists in the first place. And so we watched that TED Talk with Christopher Ryan, and he argued that human sexuality was a means to create and maintain social relationships, and only second was it a way for us to reproduce ourselves as a species. And so that kind of led us into the idea that more traditional societies, and even to some degree in modern society, women have stronger controls on their sexual behavior, and there are more significant punishments for women if they violate those rules. And so we kind of took that all the way back to the invention, if you will, the invention of agriculture. And so the idea that because agriculturalists, because early farmers were trying to pass down their land and wealth to their sons, and they wanted to make sure that their sons were actually theirs and not the guy next door, the only way to ensure that your son was yours was to control the sexuality of your wife, to control the sexuality of women. And so in sort of traditional agricultural societies, you do see a pretty significant control on the sexuality of both men and women, but particularly on women. And so there's a very high, there's a lot of importance placed on women's virginity before marriage. And then once a marriage occurs, there is no sex outside of the marriage. And if sex does happen outside of the marriage, then there are very significant punishments for it. And to some degree, we still see evidence of that today. I know we all come from different countries, but most of us come from countries where this was broadly the case, right? Where sexuality was fairly tightly controlled, and particularly that of women. And so we still see a bit of a double standard in terms of what's allowable for sexual behavior for men and what's allowable for sexual behavior for women. So we have a different set of standards, and we have, again, more severe punishments as well. And I think probably most of us would agree that there is that double standard within our cultures, because again, it's very common if you go back in history to either agricultural groups or in some cases pastoral groups as well, but we won't get into that. That's an anthropology thing. And so the overall ideology that we talked about here was patriarchy, right? The fact that men have power in society and male norms shape the creation of society, right? And so yeah, I talked about that. Good. I'm gonna skip over that. You have seen all these slides before, so don't worry about it. The last thing we talked about yesterday was gender equality, right? Because that's really what we're aiming for. We want, regardless of what your gender is, we want everyone to be able to have the same rights and responsibilities and opportunities. And people deserve these things. They shouldn't have to fight for them. And we have seen people fight for them. Particularly, we talked about women's suffrage. Women had to fight for the right to vote. And usually that's the way it works. People have to fight to be treated equally. But you shouldn't have to, right? You shouldn't have to fight to be given the same rights that everyone else already has, right? And so, again, this isn't a woman's issue. This isn't a trans issue. This is everyone's issue, right? Equality, and I'll try and get to this in the next week or so. Equality makes things better for everyone, regardless of what social group you're in. And so we said in Canada, even though we might like to imagine ourselves as gender equal, we're actually not doing that great. We're actually pretty far down the list in terms of gender equality, and we've actually fallen in the last few years. We're actually less good than we were before. And so yesterday I walked you through a few ways in which women in particular, although you could include other genders in this as well, women in particular are far more likely to suffer gender-based violence. They're far more likely to be sexually harassed and sexually assaulted. No matter really what way you measure it, women do not make as much as men in Canada for the same work. And that is not fair. And there are additional barriers that girls face as well. And so those have to do with mental health. They have to do with systemic sexism, so the way that society is kind of created for men and advantages men. We talked about a few things yesterday, but we could have talked about more. Really, we are, the problem with all of this is that we've really just kind of scratched the surface of this. And so we haven't dealt with all aspects of sexism. We haven't dealt with all aspects of its history. We haven't dealt with all the ways that it affects people in society today. And particularly, we haven't talked about how sexism is kind of pervasive around the world. And of course, that's important in our classroom because it's composed of people from around the world. So this is really just an entry point for all of us. This is, don't think of this as like, okay, we learned all about sexism and we're done and there's nothing to learn. We've really just scratched the surface of what we can do. But I think that's really all we have. I think that's kind of all we have time for. Does anyone, at this point, before we kind of say goodbye to sexism, is there anything that anyone wants to ask or bring up or say or talk about or express or anything to do with sexism? anything that we didn't say but should have said, anything that you're confused about, anything at all before we move on. Questions, comments, anything you want to say. Okay, so Casey's good, Sam's good, Mashid is okay, Dika's good, Jimmy's good, Baha's okay. Look, that coffee's really cold. Actually, it's not bad. Alright. Okay. Again, if you had any questions, you could always ask me. You could always message me or email me. But yeah, let's move it on. Manish is so far so good. Okay. So, where are we? Okay, good. Next topic is about ableism. Okay? And so, ableism, of course, has to do with disabilities. And so, probably the easiest, the thing that probably jumps to mind most quickly is people with physical disabilities. So, people who are in wheelchairs kind of comes to mind very, very quickly. But we can also kind of, in terms of physical disabilities, we can think about people in wheelchairs, so their mobility is affected, people who might not be able to see, people who might not be able to hear, people who might not be able to speak, people who might not be able to use their hands or grab onto things like this. And then we can, and there's other types too, but we'll talk about that in a sec. And then we can move on to sort of mental disabilities. So people who have serious mental health conditions, so serious depression, serious anxiety, serious cases like schizophrenia or other sort of disorders. So there's lots of different types of people that fit into the disabled group, and so sometimes it makes it difficult to talk about them because they have such diverse experiences and they have such kind of different needs for accommodation. But we'll try to get into that. But let's dig in here, okay? So a couple of things that I'll remind you about before we get into this. Stereotypes. Way back when we talked about stereotypes, the reduced or simplified characteristics of a group. And so sometimes we can think of these in sort of terms of racial stereotypes, right? What a certain racial or ethnic group is like. But it can also apply to professions, right? It can apply to what are elementary school teachers like? And I think we might have talked about them being sort of younger and women and nurturing and caring and bubbly or something. That's kind of our stereotype of an elementary school teacher. We can have stereotypes about women, right? What are women like? What are men like? Lots of comedians like to talk about that. Either way, stereotypes are kind of basic ideas we have about groups of people. And again, it can be racial groups, it can be gender groups, it can be occupational groups, and it could also be people with disabilities, right? We might have stereotypes about what they're like as well. In terms of prejudice, we know that once we attach a positive or negative value to our stereotypes, that's when we wind up with a prejudice, right? We have a preference for or a dispreference for certain people or certain groups of people because of the stereotype, right? And whether your prejudice is positive or negative, either way, it means that people are getting unearned advantages, right? Or they're not getting advantages that they actually should have. And so, again, prejudices are damaging because they create inequality where there really shouldn't be any. And again, discrimination was where we acted on our prejudices, right? We have prejudgments of others, and we behave in a certain way. We either do something or we don't do something based on our prejudice. Again, we can do this on purpose, or we can do it unintentionally. We can do it subconsciously. And so that's important to remember as well. And again, we can positively discriminate or negatively discriminate, right? So we can include people specifically because of a group they belong to, or we might exclude them because of that group as well. Yeah, okay, that's good. And finally, oppression. Remember, oppression is usually society-wide. It has to do with the way that society is constructed, and it's constructed in a way that systematically exploits one group for the benefit of the others. And so it does this, society does this through policies, through socialization, through kind of traditions and social norms and all kinds of different things that benefit a dominant group and exploit a minoritized group or disadvantage a minoritized group. And so here, keep in mind that the dominant group are people who are able-bodied, right? So people whose bodies work in sort of a quote-unquote normal way, people who don't have a major mental illness. And I think most of us fall into that, right? Most of us, I would say, even though I don't know you all very well, I would say most of us are in that dominant group. We are in the able group, right? Yeah, so these were our oppressions. We've seen that a couple of times already. And we mentioned, of course, that oppression is different than prejudice and discrimination, right? Because prejudice and discrimination happen on an individual level, right? People and small groups can express prejudice about each other. They can discriminate against one another, but oppression is different, right? Because oppression is baked into the rules of the game, right? It's baked into how the game is played, okay? Yeah, so of course we know oppression involves institutional control. It involves control of ideology, and we often kind of take this for granted, right? We take this inequality for granted because it is so ingrained in all of the things that we do that it is difficult to see. It is difficult to perceive when it's happening, and it's even more difficult to change it, okay? And then the last thing we talked about, I think the last thing we talked about before we moved on to racism, was the idea of privilege, right? The idea that some people have unearned advantages and benefits and opportunities that other people don't have, right? There's lots of examples of this. You can have white privilege, you can have male privilege, you can have able-bodied privilege, and most of us do. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Yeah, I just wanted to remind you of what it was. We talked about internalized dominance, right? So the fact that dominant groups will often express their dominant status in certain ways. And often they express it unintentionally. So they express their dominance without really knowing that they are doing it, okay? So sometimes you see people in dominant groups committing microaggressions, right? So tiny little insults, tiny little slights, tiny little reminders that one person is in a dominant group, a position of power, and the other person is in a minoritized group, a position with less power. But again, many times these microaggressions are unintentional, and so people don't realize that they are doing them. But they still do them, and they still hurt, right? They still bother people in the minoritized group. And so again, it's important to remember that, in terms of prejudice and discrimination and internalized dominance and microaggressions, you can certainly hurt people intentionally, right? But you can also very easily do it unintentionally. And so again, we kind of have to be open to that idea that we can accidentally say or do things that can hurt other people's feelings. And again, that doesn't make us bad people. It just means that we have to, learn about where our behaviors are coming from and then work to correct them, right? And so, yeah, maybe more about that later. Oh, I'm going to get rid of my questions here. Goodbye. There we go. Okay, and then of course internalized oppression is where the minoritized group acts out their minoritized status, again, often unconsciously. All right, here we go. That was just a little bit of a reminder about some things that we need to know. So ableism is this. Ableism is discrimination and social prejudice against people with disabilities or who are perceived to have disabilities, right? So it's not just about if you are in fact disabled, but does society see you that way? Do they perceive you as disabled? Often when we talk about ableism, we find that people are characterized by their disabilities. And so again, their identity as disabled comes to the front, right? And so we don't see a person, right? We don't see a person in front of us. We see a person in a wheelchair, right? And so again, remember those lenses that flip down and we start to see people through our stereotypes and prejudices. We saw it happen with the resume experiment quite a while ago. But we also see it happening with people with disabilities, right? We automatically see them through their disability, right? Their disability becomes the main thing that we see, not the person that they actually are, right? Yeah, and so on this basis, because we have certain ideas about what disabled people are or are not like, we sort of treat them in particular ways, right? And we imagine them to be particular ways. Okay. Let me just see where. Okay. Here's what we'll do. Sorry, I just needed to figure out where I was. Here's what we'll do. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I will talk about the paper structure question that we had yesterday, and then I have a short documentary to show you on ableism. So take 10 minutes, come back, we'll talk about the paper again, and then we'll move on to the documentary. Okay, so I'll see you 10 minutes. Okay, people, and we're back. So, before we go further into that ableism thing, let's talk about our final assignment. So you'll remember I assigned it to you yesterday. And I said that I wanted you to write a paper, maybe 2 or 3 pages, I think, 7 to 900 words, I think, that answers or at least explores one of these questions. Okay, so we've got 3 questions here. In what way are different social justice issues actually connected? How do individual worldviews shape or inform your understanding of social justice issues? Or what are the causes of a particular instance or manifestation of social inequality? So again, not a general one like sexism, but in particular the gender pay gap, or incidences of sexual assault on college campuses, or something narrow, right? So not just racism or just sexism. Those topics are way too big to deal with in a short paper. If you're going to pick number 3, pick something that is kind of more narrow. Okay. So I gave this to you, and the question that came up yesterday. Whoops. The question that came up yesterday was paper structure. Okay. So here's what I'll do. I don't know if this will help, but if I was writing a paper, this is what I would try to do. In this case, I kind of know a little bit about my topic already, so it's easier for me. For you, you might have to do a little bit of reading and research before you're able to put together an outline like this, but for what this is worth, I'll kind of show you what I would do, okay? So, oops. There we go. So here, I'm just gonna make this a little bit bigger. Here's my paper outline, right? So you'll remember my original question, or my original argument from when we talked about critical thinking, right? The whole coffee argument. And so I had a conclusion to my argument, right? I said that students should all drink coffee, which I don't believe, but I'm just for argument's sake here. I had a conclusion, and then I had some premises, and you'll notice that I added one premise at the end there. And basically this conclusion, this argument, is the answer to a question, right? The question is, should students drink coffee? Should I recommend to my students that they drink coffee? And so the conclusion, the answer to this question is that, yeah, I think students should all drink coffee. And so, again, as good critical thinkers, we should say, well, okay, well, why should we believe that, right? Why should students drink coffee? And so I have 4 premises here, and each of these represent a reason that one would drink coffee, right? That it's delicious, that it's inexpensive, that it will help you study and will get better grades. And so I think we said at the time that we could prove this. We could prove this in a number of different ways, right? So maybe survey, taste test, something like that, right? This one we said that we could do some web research. We could do some web research, right? We could go to Starbucks and Tim Hortons. Maybe a bar graph could come out of that showing how inexpensive it is. Coffee can help you study, get better grades. We said that we could go to scientific journals. And actually, just on the break, I found this one, So caffeine consumption habits and perceptions among University of New Hampshire students, right? So this I could use here, right? I could, oops. I could use that one right there. And if I go back and look at the abstract, I'm going to read it really quickly. This one actually might be very interesting because you'll see, let's make it a little bit bigger here. There's things in this study that talk about why students are consuming coffee, right? This one also talks a little bit about health benefits and concerns about caffeine. And it talks about their sort of perception that their grades will be better. So I just found this in 5 minutes. I don't know if it's any good, but it might provide me with some evidence for both of these things. But I'm going to have to dig in and find out what this article actually says. So this is kind of a rough outline of my argument, right? This is the answer to my question. Should students drink coffee? Yes, they should, because of these 4 premises. And then I'm going to go ahead and try to prove each of these, prove that each of these premises are true, right? I'm going to give evidence for all of them. So when I structure this in a paper, this is exactly what I will do. So I'll write an intro. I'm not going to write one right here. So I'm going to write an introduction, and in it I'm going to have a thesis statement, right? And my thesis statement is basically a 1 or 2 sentence summary of what my argument is, right? And so I'm, watch this here. Okay, so here's my thesis statement. Students should all drink coffee because coffee is delicious, it is inexpensive, it will help you study and get better grades, and it's good for your health. Boom. So that's my thesis statement right there. And so once I've sort of built a rough outline of how I'm going to answer the question and what I'm going to say, then I create a thesis statement. And so in my intro here, there'll be kind of, blah, 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 right? I'll introduce it like you all know how to introduce things, and I've seen you write introductions and you're all pretty good at it. And then right at the end of your introduction, you'll say this, right? You'll say, students, maybe I'll say all students should drink coffee because it's delicious, it's inexpensive, it will help you get better grades, and it's good for your health, right? And so when I go to paragraph 1, well, what's paragraph 1 going to be about? Well, it's going to be about this, right? It's going to say, sorry, I'm just going to get rid of this. Yeah. Oh, shoot, shoot, shoot. Why didn't you tell me you couldn't see this? Are you not paying attention? Okay. Okay, is this helping or not? Should I stop? Should I keep going? Yes, you couldn't see what I was doing, but now you should be able to. You should be able to, Casey. Oh, there, yeah. So is this helping? Are you sure? Okay. Okay. Sorry if you couldn't see what I was doing there, but you gotta tell me, okay? All right. So, what's my first paragraph? Whoops. What's my first paragraph going to be about? It's going to be this, right? So coffee is oops, there. Coffee is widely regarded as one of the world's most popular and delicious drinks, right? And then I'm gonna go, blah, 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 and I'm gonna talk about how coffee is delicious. I'm going to give evidence for the fact that coffee is delicious, right? Here, coffee is inexpensive. That was my second part, right? So maybe my topic sentence here is, in general, coffee can be seen as a okay, and then blah blah, right? So I'm going to explain, I'm going to give evidence for the fact that coffee is inexpensive, right? And so I'm going to use my web research here. Maybe I'll include my bar graph, and I'll show you that coffee is in fact inexpensive, right? Here, whoops, paragraph 3. Sorry, I was quiet there for a second, but I can't type and write at the same time. So here's paragraph 3. Here's my topic sentence. A number of scientific studies have demonstrated that coffee can help students study and get better grades. In a recent study of blah, 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 blah. So, then I keep going, right? My last paragraph here I already used widely regarded. Don't use the same thing. See that? Okay. Okay, so then my fourth paragraph here, coffee is generally understood to be good for your health. Recent studies have shown blah, 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 right? And so once I'm done that, then I'm going to write a conclusion. And basically, my conclusion is going to be a reverse, almost, of my intro, right? So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to start my conclusion with a restatement of my thesis, okay? So I'm going to say that, let me get rid of that. So this isn't the best thing to say, but I'll just go with it for now. As has been demonstrated, because coffee is delicious, inexpensive, and because it will help you study, get better grades, and is good for your health, all students should drink coffee, okay? And then, again, blah, 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 more conclusion, right? Which, of course, you're all good at sort of winding things up and concluding things. So, this is basically how I would structure a paper, right? And so you figure out what the answer to your question is going to be based on your research and organize it according to an argumentative structure here, right? So your conclusion, the sort of main point that you want to make, the premise, so the evidence or the reasons that we should believe that the conclusion is true, and then maybe a little bit of support for each of these premises that shows that each premise is true, right? And then basically you just use that to create your paper, right? You do a bit of introductory stuff, you create a thesis statement like this, your paragraphs follow the thesis statement, and then in your conclusion you basically restate your thesis, you say it again so people remember what you told them, and then you kind of wrap it up like you normally do. One of the things I like to say about this, particularly about the thesis statement, is that you should always tell your readers where they're going to, where you're going to take them, okay? Don't keep your readers in suspense, okay? This is not a murder mystery or a ghost story. Don't keep your readers in suspense. They don't like it. If people don't know what the point of what they're reading is or where it's going, they tend to get lost and they tend to ask themselves, why are they reading this? And so, of course, I'm going to read it because that's my job, but kind of in real life, it's a good idea to explain to people where you're going to take them. And so think about it this way. So if Manish and I are going to go to the movies on Saturday, right? So I say, hey Manish, you want to go grab a movie? He says, sure, okay, good. I'll pick you up at 1 o'clock. So on Saturday, I drive over to Manish's place, 1 o'clock, he hops in the car, we drive off. But instead of going to the movies, we go to the gas station and get some gas. Okay, whatever. And then we go to the post office and I pick up something from Amazon. And then I go and run into the grocery store. And Manish is going to be like, where are we going? Like, I thought we were going to the movies. We go to all these places. Are we ever going to go to the movies? What is going on, right? He's going to be annoyed. He's going to be frustrated. He's going to be confused, right? But if when I pick up Manish at 1 o'clock and he hops in the car and I say, look, we're going to go to the movies, but I just got to grab some gas, pick up something from the post office, and run into the grocery store for a minute, and then we'll go to the movies, and we got lots of time, right? If I tell him that, then Manish can be like, oh, okay, cool. And so as we go to all of these places, Manish can relax, right? Because he knows we're going to go and get gas and to the post office, and he knows that we're going to get some groceries before we go to the movies. So he's not frustrated or confused or annoyed. And so when you do this, in your, there we go. When you do this in your paper, if you see my thesis statement here, this is my version of telling Manish where we're going to go, right? I'm saying all students should drink coffee because it's delicious and it's inexpensive, helps you study, and it's good for your health. So now the reader reads that and they're like, okay, I know what this is about now. I know that you're going to try and convince me to drink coffee, and you're going to tell me all these things. You're going to try and prove to me all of these delicious and inexpensive and grades and health claims that you are making, right? So right from the very beginning, right from the introduction, the reader knows what's coming, right? They know how it's going to go. And so when you get to the end, if you tell them all of these things, and then you get to your conclusion here, the reader's like, oh yeah, okay, I remember I read this thing, and the author told me that coffee was delicious and inexpensive, and it helped you study, and it helped you get better grades, and it's good for your health. And so this author is saying that all students should drink coffee. Okay. So it becomes very clear to the reader from the beginning what they're going to see and hear. Then they're going to see and hear it, and then you're going to review it for them at the end. You're going to drive it home so that they understand it. So Manish says here, so basically we go direct to the point, but we also make it clear and elaborate at the same time, not to take it off track. Clarity is good. Okay. And so I don't know, I don't know kind of how you all have been kind of taught to write, but clarity is good, directness is good. Don't keep people in suspense. Suspense is good for a story, right? It's good for a fictional story. For academic writing, it's not good. People don't like to be kept in suspense. Kind of the clearer and more direct you can be, the better it is. And your place to kind of elaborate on things, your place to kind of, discuss things is usually within the paragraph. Okay, so you start off, let me just go back to my thing here. So you start off nice and clear. Whoops, I'm just going to get rid of Manish there. You start off nice and clear with paragraph 1. Coffee is widely regarded as one of the world's most popular and delicious drinks. And so that might be a good opportunity to say, people have been drinking coffee for a long time. It was, reserved for Egyptian royalty. I don't know if that's true. I'm making things up now. But that would be the place to kind of give a little bit of background on how delicious and exclusive coffee is before you get to the good stuff, right? Before you try to prove to the reader that coffee is delicious, that statement is true, or at least mostly true. And so there is kind of a lot to be said for just being direct, right? Especially in this kind of phase of your writing career. Later, when you're all sort of famous, popular writers and you're all making millions of dollars a year, then you can write whatever you want, right? You can forget about the structure. Of course, you'll learn more complicated structures and you'll be able to write different things. But for writing a paper like this, writing an academic paper like this is kind of the easiest and most direct thing to do. And, it's not flowery, and it's not, it's not particularly artsy, but again, it very clearly demonstrates what the answer to the question is. And the other thing I'll say too is that lots of times when students are writing, often they don't go to the trouble um, of doing this step here, of coming up with your outline. Okay, so the answer to the question here and sort of what the premises are going to be. And if you can figure this out, then you can very easily write your paper. And when you write your paper, you won't get lost, right? Because you'll always have a roadmap. You'll always know where you're supposed to be going. And sometimes when students don't create an outline, they start writing and they write kind of everything they know, and then they're like, oh, I don't know where to go anymore. I don't know what to write now, right? And because they don't have a map, right? They've left the house, they've got in the car, they've started driving, but they don't know where they're going. And so they kind of get lost, and their paper is kind of going all over the place because they haven't kind of figured out what they want to say before they say it, right? And so so Chan says, do you need to write this outline? No, you can just dive right in, but it's really going to make your life easier, and ultimately my life easier too. It's really going to make your life easier if you know what you're doing. Okay, and so with this one's a little different because this one that I'm working with, it's obviously a much simpler question. In the assignment, I'm asking you more difficult questions, and this is a bit of an opinion question, which is easier to answer. It's a kind of a yes or no question, which is easier to answer. But what I want to prove to you, or what I'm trying to show you, is that I made this very simple argument months ago, right? I said you should drink coffee because of this, this, and this, but I could write a paper on this, right? I could write a legitimate, honest to God, real paper from this, right? All I have to do is do some research to fill out my paragraphs, right? I need some research to back up my statement that coffee is popular and delicious, right? I need to find some evidence of that. Whether it's scientific or whether it has to do with, how many billion tons of coffee beans are sold every year. People aren't drinking it because it's disgusting, right? They're drinking it because they enjoy it. I don't know how I would prove that statement, but because I know what my premise is, I know what to look for, right? I know what I have to prove, right? What I have to demonstrate to be true. And same thing in paragraph 2. I know that paragraph 2 has to prove that coffee is inexpensive. And so I can compare the prices of different drinks. I could do some math and figure out how much it costs to make it at home. I could look at how much money people in Canada make every year and say, look, this is nothing at all, right? It's barely an expense. It's so cheap. As long as paragraph 2 kind of shows that coffee is not that expensive, right? And so if you kind of break it down this way, you can very easily figure out what you need to look for, what kind of things that you need to be able to say and need to be able to prove. And when you get to the end, the paper has some sort of structure, right? It actually adds up to something, right? It's not just a bunch of information about coffee, right? And if I didn't have this, if I didn't have a decent outline to start with, there's a very real danger that that's exactly what my paper would be. It would just be a bunch of information about coffee that I found on the internet that doesn't really add up to anything. Okay, and so, but this way my paper means something at the end, right? This way my paper actually answers the question and says, yes, students should drink coffee. And I've made an argument for it. I've backed it up with evidence. And, the paper is a solid answer to this pretty simple question. So Manish is asking here, if we do write an outline, should we submit it with the research paper to show the path we came up with from scratch? I would say no. I would say no. If you want me to look at your outline ahead of time and see if it makes sense, then I'm okay with that. In theory, Manish, in theory, if you've done this and you've written your paper from an outline, I should be able to figure out what your outline was, right? And so, because if you look at mine here, I built the paper directly from my outline, right? And so my premise, coffee was delicious, and in paragraph 1, that's exactly what I said for the topic sentence. I came right out and said, coffee is popular and delicious, right? The same thing for premise 2. Coffee can be seen as a relatively inexpensive beverage. And so, in theory, if I just went through your paper and I read the thesis statement and then I read the first sentence of every paragraph, I should be able to see your outline. I should be able to see this sort of skeleton of your outline right there in your topic sentences, okay? And often that's what I'll do when I'm reading other articles. If I've got like a big long article in a newspaper or something and I don't have time, or I just want to see what it's about, often I'll just read the first sentence in every paragraph, and that'll give me some idea of what the whole thing is about. Not everyone structures their writing the way that I'm showing you, but it's a nice, easy way to get your point across. And that's really what you want to do in a situation like this. You don't want to confuse the reader. You don't want to keep them in suspense. You don't want to hide things till the very end and then poof, reveal it like a magician. Don't do that. Tell people exactly what you're going to tell them at the beginning. Tell them those things, and then summarize it at the end and say, this is what I told you. This, and this, right? And so that makes your writing really clear, really organized, and then people know what the paper is about. And again, without that, think of it as a skeleton, right? Without a skeleton, you're just kind of a blob on the floor. And so your paper is similar. Without a skeleton, it's just kind of a blob on the floor, and people don't know what to do with it, right? Okay. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how helpful is that? 1 being totally unhelpful, 10 being super helpful. I'm kind of hoping that you knew most of that stuff before, but if you didn't, then maybe it's useful. I don't know. But what do you think? Was that helpful in any way? Good reviews. $9.125. I'm glad you were so precise there. Okay, 898. Okay, yeah. Don't. There's a temptation, and it's not just high school students. It's university students too. There's a real temptation to try to sound smart about things, right? And so to use lots of big words and long sentences, and to try to be, to try to sound as fancy pants as you possibly can. But really there's a real beauty to being direct and simple, right? If you understand something, you can explain it simply. You don't have to sort of, open the thesaurus and start throwing big fancy words out. You can simply say exactly what you mean. Really? Are you guys just being nice to me, or is this actually helpful? Both are okay, but I'm just curious. already most of it, but knowing that I can use it here. Yeah, you can always use it here. Or I think, ugh, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I think it would be useful for really any type of paper that is in any way argumentative. So in any paper where you're being asked a question, right? Even if it's like an English essay, even if it's like an English essay and you're saying, what do you think are the major themes of The Fault in Our Stars, right? And so you can use this structure for that too. You can say the major theme in The Fault of Our Stars is loss. I don't even know what it is, but is loss, right? And well, why do you believe that? Well, 3 reasons. Because at this point in the book, this happens, and we always hear about this. And so you can use the same structure to argue a point in an English essay, or in really any discipline, right? In history, in sociology, if you have to make an argument, so if you're being asked a question and you need to back up the answer with some sort of evidence, you can use this. You can use this structure, and it will work for you. And again, you don't need to be super fancy, right? Once I've figured out what my argument is, once I've figured out what I'm going to say, then I basically just borrow, my premise here, coffee is delicious. And so I just I make it into a topic sentence for paragraph 1, right? I've fancied that statement up a little bit, but that's what it is, right? And the same thing for my second premise. It became the topic sentence for my second paragraph, and so on, and so on. And again, my thesis statement, which was important, also wound up in my conclusion. I reorganized it a little bit so it wasn't exactly the same wording, but I said basically the same thing, right? It reinforces the message of the paper. And again, that's kind of what you want to do, right? You want to make sure that the reader understands your argument, understands the reasons they should agree with you, and when they get to the paper, when they get to the end of the paper, they should pretty clearly say, okay, I know what that was about, right? I know the person was trying to tell me this, 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 and this, and I believe them, or I don't because of this. But either way, it's a nice, clear way to communicate your ideas, and even if you don't care about that, it's a way you can help organize your writing, right? And so it becomes easier to figure out what to write next. It becomes easier to find information on the internet or wherever because you actually know what you're looking for, right? You know the kind of information that you want to support your point. And so that can be just a benefit in itself, because there's nothing worse than, typing away and writing, and then you're like, I have no idea what to say now. I don't know where to go. I don't know where I am. I don't know how to finish this thing. I'm lost in a sea of information, right? And I would say that part of that feeling of being lost is not having your outline, right? Not having worked this out ahead of time. And so, again, for me in this example, it was super easy to do because I already knew what my argument kind of was. And, I sort of, we had talked about it before, so I know the kind of things that I would look for. For you, in doing a paper like this, it's going to be a little different. You're going to have to do a little bit of reading before you can do something like this. Okay, so it's going to get noisy outside there. The process for you will not be write an outline and then go research. For you, it's going to be do a little bit of reading and research, maybe try to come up with an outline, do a little more reading, maybe say, oh no, that's not good, maybe I need something else there. And so for you, it'll be a bit of a back and forth process, right? You won't be able to just create an outline and start writing unless you actually know a lot about the subject you're writing about. Again, for some of you though, maybe, we've been in social justice for 11 weeks now. You kind of know how social justice stuff works. Some of you might have particular interests within the sort of social justice world, and you might know things already and have experience. So you can kind of go in that direction, and it can be easier for you because you know things already, right? But either way, be ready for a little bit of back and forth stuff. In real life, I might create this outline here, but as I kind of do research, maybe I find that, this one is weak, right? This coffee is delicious. I can't prove it. There's no evidence for it, and if people don't like it, then what can I say, right? So maybe I just decide that, forget it. It's no good. I'm just going to start with coffee is inexpensive, right? Or maybe not. Maybe I do find stuff and I decide to keep it. Okay, so the word on the street is that was helpful. Okay, I see there's lots of 8s and 9s and 9.125s and 10s. So hopefully that was helpful. Again, at this stage in your writing career, the more organized and clear you can be in terms of your writing, the better you are, right? Because teachers are trying to figure out what you know and how you think. And so if you very clearly can communicate that, then so much the better, right? It doesn't have to be super fancy. And again, you can use a few fancy words, but if you don't know how to use them, then they just kind of muddy the water. They sort of cloud the picture for people. Maybe the last thing I'll say before I finish here is another tip. And often students like to quote a lot of things or quote too much. I would say try not to quote at all, okay? Quotes usually don't add anything to your writing. They usually interrupt your flow or interrupt your voice. So you're in the process of saying something, and then if you include this quote kind of comes in from nowhere, and if you really don't know how to handle the quote or deal with it, it really it's something that you trip over when you're reading, okay? And so really the only reason that people usually quote things is if the actual words that are said are really important. And so if you watch the news, for instance, you'll often see that Donald Trump's tweets are quoted because tweets are really short, right? And so every word matters. And in part, they're trying to tell you not only what Trump said, but what he meant. And so if you're going to understand what he meant, you actually need to see the exact words that he tweeted out. And so often the news will quote him. And so where actual words are important, then quote. But don't quote something that you could paraphrase. Don't quote something that you could very easily say your own way on your own and then just cite it later, okay? So I would aim to use no quotes unless there's something that's just so important that you just have to put it in there. Go ahead, but usually there's no need for it. Usually there's no need to quote stuff. Maybe in English class, because of course if you're reading a story or if you're reading a poem, the exact words do matter. But kind of in the social sciences like this, you usually don't need to quote things. You just need to cite them. You just need to reference them. Okay. What do you think? Is that good? Is that helpful? Is that useful? Are you all expert writers now after 20 minutes of me talking? If only. Okay. So Casey's good. Maybe the other thing. Erica's good. Maybe the other thing is other things you'd like to, not an expert but better. Okay, that's what we're going for, Karen. Better is better. Baja's okay. Yeah, are there other things that you'd like me to deal with? So Casey asked the question about paper structure today, and she got all of this. She got all of this. So are there other things that you would like me to address tomorrow or on Friday? Well, I was kidding about the expert thing. I'm not an expert either. Actually, I think I'm a very average writer. I don't think I'm particularly good at it. I can write stuff if I need to, but I don't feel I'm particularly talented at it. So yeah, so other things you'd like me to deal with tomorrow that have to do with paper writing. Works cited? Okay. I can deal with that. Works cited are a little bit trickier because there's a lot of different rules and I don't want to do every rule, but I can I can talk about citations tomorrow if you want, Baja. That's fine. I'll do that. Okay, anything else? Anything else? Okay. Well, maybe what I'll do is I'll clear my throat. There we go. Maybe I'll leave it there for today. We've only got a few minutes left. Try and get started on your paper. The sooner you have a rough outline for yourself, the easier it will be. And so, maybe do a little bit of reading, do a bit of thinking, try to figure out how you might build an answer to one of those questions. And yeah, because that will help you out, and it'll help me out too. Okay, so I will end it there for today. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for participating in the live chat. Again, you were all very nice with your number ratings for me, but I honestly do hope it was helpful. I think that's an easy way to organize your writing and sort of get your point across. Yeah, but I'll leave it there for today. Hope you all have a good afternoon. Some of you I'll see in 15 minutes or so in comparative cultures, but until then, have a good day, and I'll see you tomorrow, okay? Bye.